what we're going to be talking about is rose diseases and insect pests. And but before we start that, we need to understand that it's not one or the other, is it? It's when we're dealing with rose health issues, we're dealing with both. So when we are trying to manage our roses to maximize rose health, we're actually doing something called integrated pest management, where we're trying to deal with both insects and diseases at the same time. Now, for just a little bit of housekeeping, for those of you who are working towards your status as a consultant Rosarian and you have a test to take, you may see as we go through this seminar, you will see that some points have a little rose beside them. Well, I'd know that for the exam because that's what that rose means. So what is IPM? Well, we're going to be coupling a combination of control measures together, and it's real important that we do this in a way that is least disruptive of the environment. So the first thing we try to do, the base of the pyramid, is prevention. Then we're going to try cultural controls and sanitation. By sanitation, I mean picking up diseased leaves off the ground if they fall off. Mechanical and physical barriers can be used, biological controls, and something that we often have to use but should only be used as the last resort would be chemical control. And when we go to chemical control, we really want to only do this when it's the last resort, and we want to use the least toxic but effective choice that we have. Now, we're going to do diseases first. Do diseases or insects. We'll do them in alphabetical order as far as doing diseases first. And the first one that I want to mention is powdery mildew. Many of us are familiar with it. You get this white powdery substance on the leaves. It can be on both the top and the bottom of the leaves, but it's usually on the top. It can cause the leaves to have a blister appearance. They can twist. And it's real important to know that this disease is something that's only going to happen during periods of high humidity. I'm at my office, but I understand that at home we're getting a rain shower. And it was already humid when I left the house, so I can only imagine how much more humid it's going to be when I get home. If we want to control powdery mildew, we're going to use sanitation first. We want to try to destroy as much of the infected materials as we can, and we want to get rid of those things. Now, powdery mildew is an obligate biotroph. That means that it can only live on living tissue. So if you put this in your compost pile and you work it in right away, there's no reason why you can't add it to a compost pile. Pruning and destroying symptomatic foliage, and you want to prune in a way to have that open vase-shaped structure to your rose, which promotes good air movement. The better the air movement, the lower the humidity will be inside the bush. Now, some of my slides will have fungicides on them, such as this, but I want to caution you that fungicides that are available in most states may not be available in your state, may not be legal. And in some states, like New York, something that might be labeled for upstate New York may not be labeled for the city in Long Island. So you have to check where you're at to see if a fungicide that you see that could be used for rose disease control is legal where you live. And sometime I would love for someone to explain to me exactly where upstate New York is on a map. Okay, black spot. Black spot's a very common disease. I want you to look at that leaf there on the left. You will not see a discrete border. The lesions sort of diffuse or feather out into the leaf. This is very common from black spot. Easy way to distinguish it from any other leaf spot, because all other leaf spots are going to have discrete borders. The leaves may turn yellow. Another term for that is chlorotic, and then they may drop off or defoliate. So we can also have lesions on the canes. They may be purple and red. To most of the public, they may be insignificant in appearance. It's been my experience with many Rosarians that anything other than a green cane has significant appearance issues to them. So it all is in the eyes of the beholder. One of the interesting things about black spot is leaf wetness. The Conidia have to have a minimum of 6 hours of continuous wet moisture. When I say wet, this is not humidity. This is actually water for them to germinate. The spores are dispersed in splashing water. That's one reason why we try to keep the foliage as dry as we can. The pathogen will overwinter on fallen leaves and on stems. Now, there is resistance. And this is from one of my old resistance trials, one of Ping Ling's roses. My girl is on the left, and you see a piece which we were using as a control is on the right. And these roses had not been sprayed for 3 years. And you can see that how profound resistance can be. But you have to understand a couple of things about disease resistance. And that is that the pathogen is genetically variable in different areas of the country. By the time I finished screening, I had 8 different races in my field. And some of the things that had been resistant in years 1 and 2 were not resistant as 3 as more races appeared in the field. So that tells you that maybe in one part of the country, something will look resistant, may not look resistant in another part of the country, and something that may have been resistant in your garden for many years may start to show some symptoms of black spot, because this fungus is capable of mutating. So this is issues. Some resistance, though, has held up very well, but it doesn't always hold everywhere. And that's just something we have to remember always about disease resistance. So here's those purple spots on the canes that you see on the left. So we want to keep our leaves as dry as possible. A gentleman last year told me that, not for his roses, but he had some big fans on his deck to keep the deck boards dry, because his wife had mobility issues. And he noticed that wherever the fans were blowing towards the roses, they didn't have black spot, but the ones that were not downwind from the fans did. He did not spray for black spot. And that's just another example of how important it is to try to keep your foliage as dry as possible. So, and that, of course, comes with good air movement. We want to reduce inoculum by sanitation, and we're going to use fungicides on a regular schedule if needed. Now, another disease, especially in the southeast, that is often mistaken for black spot is Cercospora leaf spot. Now, you can see in the picture that the lesions have a discrete border. They don't feather out, but they do look like, in some ways, like black spot. It's favored by the same environment as black spot. It's controlled by the same fungicides. Resistance is available in some cultivars. There are some roses that are resistant to both. Many shrub roses that are resistant to black spot are susceptible. So often I get people telling me that their roses that are supposed to be resistant to black spot or have black spot all over them. And I say, send me a sample. And when they do, it's the Cercospora leaf spot, not black spot. Downy mildew is another foliar disease. It's not a true fungus. It's actually more closely related to brown algae and diatoms than it is to fungi, but it looks like a fungus, and we treat it in many ways like we would a fungus. The spores can germinate in just a few hours, and in 3 days, the plants can become symptomatic. And sometimes the plants will begin to defoliate before we see symptoms. Now, the species name of this Peronospora is sparsa, and that's because the amount of mycelium that you can see of this downy mildew is very, very sparse on the back of the leaves. And in that bottom picture, hopefully you can see those white patches of sparse fungus growing, or fungal-like organism growing on the back of those leaves. Now, this pathogen is going to overwinter in stems and roots. So when you get it, it can be very difficult to get rid of. Downy mildew loves cool, high, humid weather. For this pathogen to be active, the humidity has to be above 85%, which often is in a polyhouse at night. And that bottom, those two pictures are the same greenhouse. That is day 1, and you see what happened on day 3. That's just 48 hours later. So defoliation can be very, very rapid. This disease can practically just explode on you. So what can we do? Well, proper pruning to promote good air movement. Once again, we want to avoid overhead irrigation whenever possible in cool weather. We want to inspect our roses carefully in the spring, pick off any leaves that we see that may be symptomatic for downy mildew. We want to pick up any drop leaves. You know, we don't want to use a leaf blower around our roses in the summer. That's for rosette. But most people don't realize that there's an attachment that comes with that leaf blower where you can turn it into a vacuum and put a bag on it and vacuum stuff up. And this is a good thing to use to pick up drop leaves from downy mildew. And so strip the bush if you have to. It's in the spring. It'll refoliate. Now, when we come to fungicides for downy mildew control, labeled for homeowners is Agrifos and Mangazel. Both of these are excellent for downy mildew control. They are not systemics, so you're going to have to spray every 7 to 10 days until temperatures get above 78 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, there are other things available for commercial applicators to use, but many of these things are not labeled for homeowners in many states. So once again, you've got to be very cautious. And also with these commercial application materials, there can be different trade names that have the same active ingredient, or you may find things like Compass and Heritage that have the same mode of action. So you want to make sure that if you're rotating, that you're rotating something different. Now, Mangazel is affected not due to the fungicide, but due to the zinc that is attached to that fungicide. And Agrifos and Mangazel have very different modes of action. And actually, there's never been any reports to resistance to zinc. Another disease that occurs more where it's cooler and also in the very, very deep south is Anthracnose. Now, it occurs at different times of year. If I was at Longwood Gardens in the Northeast, I would be dealing with Anthracnose in spring and early summer when it's still relatively cool. if I was in New Orleans, I would be dealing with this thing in the winter if we haven't had a killing frost and I still have foliage. I know my wife is from South Louisiana. I know that we have walked in the rose gardens in New Orleans many times at Christmas smelling roses when they were just in beautiful bloom. And so but it was cool, but it wasn't cold. And this is a good environment for Anthracnose. Control is very similar to black spot. So if you've been having problems with Anthracnose, it's an issue. Now, one way you can tell it from Cercospora and black spot and downy mildew is that Anthracnose is going to have discrete lesions like Cercospora. But if you have just a magnifying glass and you look at the spots, the center of the spots will have flecks in them that look like little grains of pepper. This is the fruiting bodies of the fungus that causes Anthracnose. You won't see those in Cercospora, so you can tell it apart that way. The lesions tend to be oval or circular. In downy mildew, they're going to be more angular, and they're going to be more maroonish, red, purple. So they're pretty distinct as well. So it's not hard when you think about it a little bit to tell these things apart. Botrytis Blight is something that happens when it's hot. It says favored by cool, wet weather. That is when it's going to be bad on the foliage. But in the summertime, if we don't deadhead when we can, or we're having a lot of rain, we can have Botrytis Blight, especially on older blooms. So it's real important to deadhead bushes on a regular schedule. Fungicides may be useful, but here's the problem. A good friend of mine who's retired from Penn State did some work with botrytis in greenhouses, and he found that resistance developed in greenhouses to this fungus when he used fungicides in 2 days. And in a week, the fungicides would be totally ineffective. So this can be a very difficult thing to control with fungicides. Another very closely related thing, we could call it petal spots. I call it ghost spotting, and one reason why is it's very difficult to tell what's causing it because there are a number of fungi that can cause this, and you can isolate many of them from the same rose petal. And this is a disease that the rose looks good one day, you walk out the next day, and where did all these spots come from overnight? Well, that's where the ghost comes from. So, ghost spotting is associated with rainfall. Many, many years ago, the Lake Clyde Chapel here in Knoxville was entered a rose show, and he won everything. He won everything that you could win on the both in miniatures and in hybrid teas. I was new to Knoxville. I went to see him, and I said, Clyde, how did you win? We've been having a lot of rain. And he took me out back, and he had Kentucky Fried Chicken buckets on bean poles over his blooms. And it had protected his blooms from the rainfall. And while everybody else had ghost spotting, he did not. This can be very difficult to control with fungicides. Fungicides are usually ineffective during times of unusually wet weather. And so while this can be different, and there you see the paper or cardboard bucket, it certainly worked for Clyde. I have 50 of those in my garage. I'm still waiting to use them, but one day I might. A disease, usually if it's a problem on the West Coast, is rust. If you live on the West Coast, you probably are very familiar with this disease. Sometimes I like to say it's the West Coast version of black spot, but it's a very, very different fungus. In the eastern United States, we can get it. Usually will not overwinter here, but we can get it when we bring new roses into our garden that may have had some latent rust infections on some of the stems. and it can cause a big problem for one summer if we're not careful. Now, in the last few years, there have been some issues with rust overwintering in the coastal regions of Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida. And the reason for that is the foliage doesn't go dormant. If it goes dormant, well, that pretty well ends rust. It's going to have yellow spots on the upper surface and pustules. If you touch it with a tissue or a paper towel, you're going to see spots, yellow streaks and smears on your tissue. So what do we want to do? We want to inspect plants when they arrive to make sure we don't have rust. I told you how to do the tissue test, and fungicides such as propiconazole, which is found in Fertilone systemic fungicide, microbutanil, which is found in Immunox, and tebuconazole, which is found in Bayer's Advanced fungicide. All of these triazoles are excellent for rust. A disease that's becoming of more prominence, unfortunately, is canker. Canker can be caused by a lot of different fungi. The cankers can be white, they can be yellow, they can be brown, they can be purple, they can be black. The plants or the cane can wilt very rapidly, usually becomes active during the winter months. And it's very critical. You know, we're not often in late December and January walking our roses like we do when they have flowers. But we need to be walking those rose bushes, inspecting for rose canker. And when we find it, we prune it out. Fungicides have not proven useful. Now, in the Pacific Northwest, there is a disease that's had very little attention, and it's a canker disease. And cankers are usually dark purple to black, and it's caused by the bacterium Pseudomonas syringae. Now, I think I may have seen this on samples that had come in. I got some samples last year from South Carolina that I couldn't get any fungi out. I did not think about Pseudomonas syringae because it's not found, ever been reported in the Southeast. But that doesn't mean it's not here because of the way we move bushes around. So this is something that you need to watch for. Sanitize pruners between cuts. In the Pacific Northwest, if this is a problem, they recommend copper sprays right when the foliage is coming out. And then again, when leaves start to fall off in the fall, that will help some with bacterial canker. Another problem that is becoming an issue both in the Southeast and in California is Armillaria Root Rot. This will take out large trees, hydrangeas, azaleas, rhododendrons, roses, practically any plant that's not a grass or herbaceous. And you often will see honey-colored mushrooms at the base of the plant, as what you see in these photos here. Roses will lose their vigor and die. They can die rather rapidly. This fungus persists in the soil and you can't get rid of it. It's very difficult to deal with. The only thing I have ever found published that will help you with this disease is to get ahead of it, dig a 4-foot trench, and put a 4-foot long, high piece of sheet metal, and then backfill around the sheet metal. Now that seems extreme. That was recommended by the University of Illinois, but that's all we got. The only other thing we can do is return the bed to grass or herbaceous plants. When I have had to deal with this, I usually recommend that this is a bed from now on, you're going to want to grow ornamental grasses in. I wish I had better luck. I pray you don't get it, but when you do, it's a mess. And unfortunately, there's not much we can do about it. removing soil and replacing it, you're just not going to get ahead of it that way. Crown gall. That's another bacterial disease caused by Agrobacterium tumefaciens, and it causes large galls on the roots, on the stems, on limbs. The galls can turn dark and be woody. This is something we want to inspect for. This is a good reason to buy bare root plants, because you can look at those roots to make sure that you're not introducing crown gall. Because here's the problem. Agrobacterium tumefaciens is a soil inhabitant. That means once it's in the soil, it will persist there as a saprophyte indefinitely. So if you have a plant that has it, you dig the plant up and you have to remove 2 bushels of soil from that hole before you can replant and put new soil in. Now, what do you do with that soil? Well, grass is not a host. So I always tell people, put the soil in a wheelbarrow, go downstream from where any of your roses or other beds are that have that you might worry about crown gall on something, and just spread it thinly on your grass if you don't have another choice, because grass is not an option. We can inoculate plants with crown gall with contaminated pruners. So if you had problems with crown galls, I would wipe my pruners with alcohol or Lysol wipes, or dip them in rubbing alcohol or some kind of sanitizing thing. I don't recommend Clorox or bleach, because bleach can corrode metal and dull your pruners. But you need to do that between bushes if you are concerned about crown gall. Now, when we look at viruses, rose mosaic is a very common one. The problem is there are 3 viruses that are commonly associated with rose mosaic, but there can be as many as 7 that will be classified as rose mosaic virus when it appears in a plant. Because of that, the symptoms can be variable. Are the symptoms from one virus? Is it from a combination of 2, a combination of 3 or 4 or 5? Which ones are they? Because of that, the symptoms can be very, very different. Symptoms often include line patterns and rings, ring spots. There is no cure. The good news is this is a disease that is spread in propagation. So it's usually not a problem in the garden of spreading from one bush to the other. Some cultivars are less tolerant of rose mosaic than others, and the ones that are less tolerant may be stunted and have smaller blooms. Other ones that have rose mosaic, it's a challenge for me to tell any difference in their vigor from a rose of the same cultivar that does not have it. So this is something that is very variable in roses, and it's hard to make any types of generalizations that will be accurate for most roses. Now, one of the questions that's on the test is, what does rose rosette look like? This is caused by rose rosette virus. It is spread by microscopic mite that's not related to spider mites at all. It's an aerified mite. Often the shoots are erect. They may stand above the other foliage. The foliage on the shoots will have thin, often red leaves, but the leaves can be green. They're called strap because they're like a razor strap. They're long and thin. Stems can be flattened. They can have hyperthorniness or an unusual number of thorns. The thorns can be very irregular. Often what I do is look on a shoot that I think is rose rosette, look on a shoot of the same plant that is not showing symptoms, and then look at the difference to see if the thorns look the same. If it's rose rosette, often they do not. Now, sometimes they'll form these witch's brooms or rosettes. The witch's brooms can become quite large. Now, I'm going to be a little harsh. there's no excuse for a rosette. They do not appear overnight. They take weeks to develop. If you see a rosette beginning, and there are tools to help you detect it early, you need to get it out, because the mites will build up to 100 times higher on that rosette tissue than they do on asymptomatic tissue on the same bush. So you got to get it out. You got to get it out right away, or it will spread. And so symptoms, I mentioned, stand higher. Canes can be thick. Leaves are distorted and thin. We've got weird thorns going on. We can do this, and I'll show you an aid that will help you in a few minutes. You can have distorted flowers, and I've seen the witch's brooms get bigger than a bushel basket and actually pull the plant over. Well, there's no excuse for that either. I mentioned that they're spread by aerified mites. This is what the mite looks like. It's conical. Notice, no wings, no eyes, no nose, no ears. So it can't smell your roses. It can't hear. It can't see. And it's like a dust particle floating in the air. And so most of them are not going to land on your rose bushes. But if you leave those rosettes in your garden for any period of time, enough of them will balloon or blow to, and some of them will land on the other roses. There's work going on right now, and it looks like you only need one viliferous mite to land on your rose bush for that bush to be in trouble. Now, so what are we going to do? Well, the time for action is in the top left corner. You see that one thickened stem? Look at the thorns on it. The leaves are getting thinner compared to that other stem that is more, that is asymptomatic. That's the time to catch it. You get that out, you are not having the disease spread to other bushes by mites. Mites are not ballooning at that stage. But if you let a rosette start to develop, you're in big trouble. So we want to get in there and we want to dig that plant up and get it out. You may want to send it to a state diagnostic lab for confirmation, and then expect neighboring plants in that bed often. And I often get asked, how often? A minimum of once a week. I tell people they ought to be doing it a couple of times a week. But we're Rosarians. We're in our beds a couple of times a week. It's a hobby. And so this should not be a problem of inspecting our roses for rosette. Now, another disease that can happen, and I've had several cases that I've had to deal with this in South Alabama this year, is root knot nematode. These are worm-like creatures. Root knot nematode can go to tomatoes. It can go to peppers and eggplants. Lord have mercy, it can even go to a dogwood. But it's not necessarily the same species. But one of the things that the plants will just not be very vigorous. You can add fertilizer, irrigation, they're in full sun, but they just don't seem to grow. You dig them up and you find these swollen roots. And that's a good sign that you're dealing with root knot nematode. It can be very hard to control. If it's a bed that you can empty out, water it good, put plastic down, and it's in full sun all summer long, and you can take the bed out of production for one summer. You can get that, lay plastic on it, and you can solarize that bed, and that will take care of the nematodes. That's for a fact. Probably most of your weed seed too. There is a biological control product, Bacillomyces. It's not legal in every state, and it's not always easy to find. But it has shown effectiveness against root knot, so that is a possibility as well. Now let's look at some insect things before we mercifully end this for you. Aphids is a very common one. All aphids are females. Men, we're off the hook. The aphids give birth to live young, and so they can explode. Usually the damage is not real severe, but if it does start to become severe, it can lead to distorted buds, which means you're not going to be happy with your flowers. Plants that have aphids may also have a sticky substance on their foliage. This is the honeydew or the poo from the aphids. It's got a lot of sugars in it. It's very sticky. It may even start to turn black because of moles growing in the honeydew. The moles are not feeding on the foliage. They're just feeding on the sugars in that clear aphid poo. So this is what aphids look like. What can we do about them? Well, I have found that using a water wand on high pressure, and I don't mean a pressure washer, but just a water wand, and knock them off. And that's a very effective way to deal with aphids. If you have to up the ante a little bit, you may have to go to a soft pesticide like insecticidal soap. Remember, the soap has to coat the aphid. The aphid has two little tailpipes sticking out its back end, and this is how it breathes. So if we can get a soap film over those two little tailpipes, the aphid will suffocate and die. And so insecticidal soaps can be very effective. Not often, but occasionally, infestations can get so severe that we have to go up the pyramid to a insecticide such as orphine. Orphine smells. Orphine can be absorbed through our skin. So you can use it very safely, but you have to follow the labeled directions, and you have to be familiar with pesticide safety so that you don't wind up with one of those dreaded orphine highs, which in my opinion, there's no excuse for. Another insect issue is rose stem borers. This is usually small metallic bees, but it can be beetles at the same time. Canes can die fairly rapidly. There will be a hole in the cane. This is usually a cane that has been pruned, and you'll see a hole right in the center of the cane. Usually these are on canes that are a pencil size in diameter or larger. If you split that cane open, what you're going to find is that mama bee brought a lot of pollen in. She laid an egg. That egg will hatch, and then you will have the larva of the bee inside the cane feeding on that. It's not feeding on the cane, it's feeding on the food the mama left for it. Then she'll seal that one off and lay another egg and do this, and she can damage a cane quite extensively. These small bees are very important pollinators. We really don't want to kill them. But what I have found is, and many other people have as well, using an exterior wood glue, you know, when I'm deadheading or I'm pruning back roses, I prune an area on a bush, and then before I move to another part of the bush or another bush, I stop and put drops of exterior wood glue on the canes that I have wounded by pruning, and neatness does not count here. And so this seems to work very effectively. By the time the glue wears away, the cane's gotten so hard that the little bee is not interested in it anymore. A problem that happens in some of our warmer parts of the country, unfortunately, is Chilli Thrips. These are from Asia, very invasive. They have a large host range that includes many ornamental and vegetable species, including roses. And unlike flower thrips that we have dealt with for years, Chilli Thrips feed on the foliage and will wrinkle the leaves and cause brown leaves. Sometimes the leaves will have a black, distorted appearance to them, as in the middle picture. So this is something that we often have issues with. Florida, New Orleans, Houston, other areas, this can be a really bad thing. There are a number of insecticides that you can use to help with this. Some of them are more environmentally friendly than others. I encourage you to investigate that before you start to get into chili thrip control with chemicals. You may need to rotate insecticides because thrips have a reputation for developing insensitivity to overused pesticides. So this is something that we're always watchful for and fearful of. Flower thrips, I have a hard time with these two. Flower thrips often cause browning of petals. We can apply control measures, but here's a problem. Our rose petals have very poorly developed vascular systems, and it's very hard for systemics to get into our petals. So it can be a difficult thing to do. My advice is try to reduce numbers significantly, but if you have some roses you're having problems with, well, it's time to scorch earth those things for blooms, let them bloom back again in another bloom cycle, and get those thrips out of there. That's one of the things that I have found that's been useful for me. A bane of many people's existence is Japanese beetles. I remember a long time ago, Nayad Ackerman said, I don't mind Japanese beetles having sex on roses. I just wish they wouldn't eat at the same time. Now, Japanese beetles have a long life cycle. This may vary a little bit as far as the months, depending on where you live, but you know when they emerge. But they spend practically all their life feeding on the roots of turf grass. And so most of their time they are underground, and they just emerge as adults to feed, mate, lay eggs, and then they're gone. So they go about as quick as they come. And so what can we do about it? Well, now this is going to be a surprise to most of you. When I first heard about this from an entomologist in my department, I'll have to admit I was skeptical. So I spent a day in the library reading about Japanese beetles, feeding and pheromones. Many people think that Japanese beetles attract more beetles. That's not really the case. Japanese beetles are attracted to plant volatiles that are released when the plants are wounded by the Japanese beetle feeding. So we want to try to reduce feeding as much as we can. Now, the way to do this, but if you're inspecting a couple of times a week for rose rosette, you can be inspecting at the same time for those first Japanese beetles. And when you see the first ones, and you see them, you want to get rid of them. And the best way to do that is that if you touch the foliage where the beetles are at, they don't fly off by going up. They will drop a few inches before they start to fly. So if you have a little cup of water underneath that leaf where the Japanese beetle is at, it will drop into it. If it has a drop or two of dish soap in it, that will break surface tension, so they can't swim, they can't float, they sink to the bottom, and they drown. And to be frankly honest with you, it's sort of fun to watch those demons from hell drown. And if you don't let them build up, well, then you want to track things. You certainly don't want to use those bags. Another thing that I have learned is don't put your vegetable garden, if you're going to have beans in your vegetable garden, near your roses, because they are more attracted to bean volatiles than they are rose volatiles. So if you have beans nearby, you're going to attract all your neighbors' Japanese beetles. And when they eat your beans up, they're going to look around and see what else is on the buffet. And that will be your roses. Rose midge, something that occurs out in the Pacific Northwest and occurs in the Midwest and down into the DC, Northern Virginia area, and I'm afraid it's going to keep moving into other areas. This is caused by a midge or a fly. The blooms can be very distorted, and if you go digging in that distorted bloom, you're going to find maggots or a maggot like what is in this bottom picture, but it won't be that large, but you'll certainly be able to see it. Here's a picture of what the little fly looks like. Insecticidal usage can be difficult because timing is so critical. You got to get it when that fly is flying around and laying eggs, and that can be hard to predict. Buying bare root plants is a good way to prevent movement of midge maggots because they're often in the soil in that pot. The other thing is they will build up in mulch, so you got choices here. You can remove that mulch in late fall or winter. That could be useful, or it could be just useful to come in and pile several inches of new mulch on top of it in late fall or winter. They'll have a hard time climbing their way out of that. So those are things that can be done for rose midge. Another insect that we have problems with is rose slugs, also known as sawflies, because they are maggots of a sawfly. There's one species that feeds on the top. It will feed some on the bottom, and there's another species that just tends to feed on the bottom. The ones that feed on the bottom don't tend to get as big as the ones that feed on the top. And so often when people contact me about this, the maggots have pupated on the ground and they're no longer there. And when they bring them to me, there's nothing to see because the damage is old. So you can use insecticides on these things, but you got to catch them when the maggots are on the leaves and before they do any serious damage. Inspection, inspection, inspection. Cannot say that enough. Scale insects. There are many different scales that get on roses. Some can be white, they can be brown, they can be dull, they can be shiny. Insecticidal soap. If you will soak these things with soap, you'll suffocate them. And so this can be a good control method for scale insects. Leafcutter bees. I get contacted about these from time to time. They seem to like one bush in a garden or just one cultivar. That can change from one year to the next. These are important pollinators, so we don't want to kill or spray them. You know what's interesting is, as Rosarians, we stand back in horror. I don't really. I always just love how good. I mean, they can cut a circle better than you or I can with a pair of scissors. And that always amazes me. But they don't really hurt the vigor of the bush. So this is not something that I spend a lot of time on. Spider mites are not insects. They're arthropods and tiny. If there's a lot of them, we'll see them moving and webbing, which is in the bottom of the picture. Usually the tops of the leaves will be drying out. They can be corrotic, lack of chlorophyll. They can turn sort of silver looking. It's been my experience, spraying for these things can be difficult because they can develop resistance fast. But one thing they don't have resistance to is being blasted, especially on the back of leaves, with water out of that water wand again. These are tiny little things, and if you blast them 3 feet away with that water, they're not going to crawl back that season. They're just too small. They don't have wings, and that would be a very long, they'll die first before they can come back. They're usually a problem during the hot times of the year, especially if we're not having rain. Now, this particular root weevil, fortunately right now, I have not had any reports out of southern Georgia, but that's always a possibility. But certainly it has been found as far north as Jacksonville. And it's an insect, a fairly large weevil that has invaded Florida from the Caribbean. It has a wide host range, including roses, palms, and citrus. The adults feed on flowers and they feed on leaves. And this is where you will find the adults. But they lay eggs at the base of the plant or on the soil, and the larvae feed on the roots. And this is where most of the damage is done. And they can destroy canes, or canes can just seem to wilt overnight. They can destroy whole bushes. We don't know a whole lot about this root weevil. There's not been a lot of research done on it. And so basically all I can suggest for people to do right now, but if they haven't, dig the bush up. You may want to dig some of the soil out, not as much as you would for crown gall, but I would probably dig about a half a bushel of soil out with it to try to get rid of this dang thing. So there's handouts. I sent some to John. So he has them. I also, of course, have them. There is a handout on rose disease identification and management that is relatively new. How to detect rosette disease very early. And then for the diseases and insects that we talked about today, I put together a couple of sheets that just have their pictures on it to aid in identification. You can get them from ARS, or if you email me at mwindham@utk.edu, you can get them from me that way. Now, one thing that is not part of this talk, but I want to mention, is that we are working as fast as we can on resistance to rosette disease. We have identified some genotypes of roses. Unfortunately, not things that you want in your garden, or they don't necessarily have heat or cold tolerance and things like that. But we have identified some genotypes that appear to be resistant to this disease. So we have got to get that resistance into roses you want. And the way this is done is at rose breeders and geneticists at Texas A&M, and we also work with breeders in Wisconsin and private breeders as well. And they will grow the things as seedlings. They send the seedlings to me in Tennessee. We will screen them for years for resistance. It's a very harsh test. And then if they pass our test, we send the results back to Texas A&M, and those are the ones that they use. So now we've screened over 1,300 genotypes of roses for rosette resistance. And now our focus is screening on progeny from these where we're trying to develop red roses, pink roses, yellow roses, hybrid tea roses, floribundas, miniatures, climbers, shrub. You get the point. This is not something that can be done quickly or that can be done in just very easily. It's also very costly to do. So it has not started yet, but in the next month, there will be a fundraising campaign that's going to be led by the American Garden Rose Selections. Pat Shanley, Chris Van Cleve, and Paul Zimmerman will be helping UT and Texas A&M to raise money for rose resistance research. Without your help, we're going to fail. And this is not something that's done overnight. So this is going to, it's already required a lot of work. Those fields at both locations are acres in size. They're not small. And they have thousands and thousands of bushes that we are constantly working with. Takes a lot of labor, takes a lot of energy, but dang, it's fun. And that's the only reason, this project right here is why I'm not retired. And I'm going to stick with this for as long as I'm physically able to. The problem is, people doing this, we're not young. So we do feel a sense of urgency. All right, and with that, I thank you very, very much.